Hello and welcome to the program. You're listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you for joining us for another segment. We're going to be speaking with Zach Shemtob and David Latt, joining us out of New York. Zach was one of the first in the wave of people infected with COVID-19 when this pandemic first struck, but it wasn't until a year later that he was finally able to confirm the diagnosis. Initially, Zach and his husband, David, both experienced flu-like symptoms. Zach's symptoms eventually subsided. However, David was hospitalized at NYU Hospital. Thank you both for joining us here on Health Professional Radio. I'm anxious to hear this story.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Zach, if you would give us a bit of your background, what it is that you love doing about whatever it is that you do professionally.
I'm a lawyer in white-collar defense, so also nothing to do with healthcare and very little knowledge of anything to do with coronaviruses or anything like this prior to getting it and David getting incredibly ill and it sweeping across the world.
And David, a little bit of your background, if you would.
I'm also a lawyer, but I no longer practice. I now write about law and the legal profession.
We all know how New York was hit. Zach, describe your symptoms. What were you doing when you got sick?
So we were, I believe this was when, we had heard in the news and the media that there was the coronavirus, but it was kind of an abstract thing at that point because very few people in New York, and certainly no one we knew, had gotten it, or at least as far as we knew. And at one point, we were at dinner actually with friends, and David said he didn't feel particularly well. So he went home, and a day or so later, he started having, I would say, what began like flu-like symptoms and then grew worse, which he'll talk about. As for me, 2 days after that, I began to experience flu-like symptoms. It was just, for me, kind of felt like a extreme version of the flu. I was incredibly achy everywhere. And then there were some other weird symptoms, including the loss of taste and smell. I got a headache. I had some gastrointestinal issues, things of that nature.
So those symptoms, they subsided?
They did. For me, they plateaued, and I'd say I was fatigued for another week or so. The whole thing, I'd say, lasted 2 weeks. And then after those 2 weeks were done, I felt pretty much back to normal. That was unfortunately not the case with David, though.
So, David, you see Zach getting better, and you're getting worse?
Yeah, that's what happened. Eventually, I had to go to the hospital because I started having trouble breathing, unlike Zach. And so they admitted me to NYU. And this was March of last year. It was very, very hard to get a COVID test. And when I was admitted to the hospital, they gave me a COVID test. They gave me a PCR test because that was what they did for people who were admitted. But if you weren't severe enough to be hospitalized, it was very hard to get a COVID test. And so for Zach, we just suspected he had COVID, but we had no way of knowing. There are a lot of people out there who got sick in March, February, April of last year who think they had COVID, but they're not sure. And in some ways, Zach was one of them. I mean, we were pretty sure, but we weren't sure until Zach later got tested.
David is very sick. He's having trouble getting tested, and you suspect that maybe both of you are sick. How was it that you still had COVID-19 a year later? You got better, but yet you had it during that whole year. What led to you getting tested a year later?
So it wasn't that I still had COVID-19. What happens is generally the virus is gone within 2 weeks or so. It varies person by person, but it can still have lingering effects. And in most people, at least for a period of time, there are what are called antibodies, which essentially neutralize or fight the virus and create a form of temporary immunity. You can get tested for antibodies. It's generally relatively inexpensive and easy to do. You can get it from most healthcare professionals or providers. And that will show that you had COVID-19. You don't still have it, but you had COVID-19, and it will give you some comfort that you may have immunity. Now, with all these variants, it's harder to say whether you have immunity from them, but regardless, it will show you have some form of immunity. I got tested about 6 months after I had, what I suspected was coronavirus for the antibodies, and the test came up negative. Now, this is the case for many people, actually, who had the virus, where the antibodies fade over time. However, that doesn't mean you're necessarily no longer immune or that you didn't have it. There are other ways now, and this is actually, what's kind of interest here. There are companies now, including the one we used, where they can test for T cells. And T cells are another form of protection or immunity to the virus. Some of us learned about them in high school biology. They're called killer T cells, and they're more like a sledgehammer than the antibody. So when the virus invades, they respond to it by, essentially smashing and destroying it. That's about as technical as I'm going to get, given my legal background. But regardless, the T cells are also a way to fight the virus. So while you don't have antibodies, again, it doesn't mean you're not immune. Or at least don't have a form of immunity. So I was very curious, not having antibodies. Well, do I have T cells? And so we got this test, and it turned out that I still had T cells even a year later. So it's very fascinating, because you may have all these people out there who get these antibody tests, and they come up negative, and so they say, oh, wow, I either didn't have the virus, or, I no longer have any protection, but that may not be the case. If you can get a T cell test, it will show that, one, you did indeed have the virus, and you still may have some protection. Of course, the vaccine will truly give you protection, but it is very interesting to know, and could be important to know, if you also have T cell immunity.
What test did you use?
The test that we used is called the T cell detect test by Adaptive Biotechnologies. Mm-hmm. This is one of the more, widely available, commercially available tests. We took it before we got vaccinated, because a vaccine can also give you T cells. So you have to take it before you get vaccinated in order for it to give you an accurate result as to whether or not you were naturally infected with COVID. So Zach and I took it, and we were both positive. For me, it wasn't a surprise, because I actually still had antibodies. But for Zach, who no longer had the antibodies, it was notable to him and to us that he still had T cells, and it was reassuring to us to know that he still had these T cells that would fight COVID were he to get it again.
Now, I understand that you have a young son. With approvals for the vaccine for our young, what are your plans for your son, and will you be using T-Detect if it is approved by the FDA for use in children?
Oh, that's interesting. So our son actually last month, we don't know how this happened, because we thought he would have gotten it when we got it, but he actually tested positive for COVID. He's 3. He never had any symptoms, but as Zach was saying, with the variants and everything, we, I think, would get him vaccinated once it's approved, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we're waiting for the approval on that. I feel like there may be less urgency on our end, since, he already had it, and that may give him some natural immunity. But regardless, I think once, it is approved, then we would seriously consider getting him vaccinated.
And it would be interesting to see if he has T cells, if the T cell detect test is also approved for kids that young. I would be open to having him take it. The only problem is, I think it was a blood test, right, Zach?
And correct. It's a blood test, so it's easy for adults, but don't know if we're
getting that much blood out of him could be a challenge, but I don't know.
Regardless, it's easy to do for adults.
Well, I appreciate you both joining us here on Health Professional Radio this morning. Obviously, you're doing well. I hope you continue to do so, you and your son as well. Give us a website where we can learn more about T-Detect COVID.
So to learn more about T-Detect COVID test, it's really simple. Just go to tdetect.com. It's T-detect.com. So T, then a dash or a hyphen detect.com.
Again, thank you both for joining us here on the program.
Hey, thank you.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Zach Shemtob and David Lett. Audio copies of this program are available at 8pr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download it, SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.